Hi friends, I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about a special topic we call the carrot and the stick, which has to do with reward and punishment. And I really want to talk about something about raising children, but I want to give a little spiritual background to it first. You know, in the summer months, in the months of August, the Jewish people are usually reading through the Torah in the synagogues in the book of Deuteronomy. If you remember, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5 is the Ten Commandments, chapter 6 is Hear, O Israel. But then there's two major sections from chapter 7 all the way up through chapter 16, which are two Torah portions. One is called the Ekev and the other is called the Re'eh. And I just want to, these whole sections, let's just read this for a moment. In Deuteronomy 11, verse 26, it says, Re'eh anochi noten lifnechem hayom bracha v'klala, and then after it says that atem tu bruchim. He says this, behold, I've set before you good and bad, blessing and evil. But then he says that, and if you obey me, then you will be blessed. It's a simple idea of obedience and blessing. In chapter 7, it starts that whole section there, which starts with the word ekev. I haven't found that translated correctly. Most people says, if you will hear my commandments, but it really says ekev is following in the footsteps of somebody, and ekev is your footstep. And it says, following the footsteps of the fact that you would obey God, you will be blessed. As a result of your obeying God, you will be blessed. So it's very simple. There's 9 chapters in the center of the book of Deuteronomy. It says, get the point. If you obey me, you'll be blessed. If you disobey me, you're going to be punished. And this is a very central aspect of our understanding God, that we have to obey him. When he tells him, tells us to do something, just as a child has to obey his parents. And God says, I'm giving you these commandments, not because I want to see you do something. I'm giving you them so you can obey, so that I can bless you. I love you. I'm for you. But you have to be able to obey to able to come into the blessings. Now this has a rule that can be picked up in any kind of behavioral science. The general rule of all humanistic behavioral science of anything, which is that any human behavior that you will reward will be repeated, and any human behavior that you punish will cease. That's it. That's how you train a dog. If he does something right, you give him a little doggy biscuit. So basically what we want to look is that this is the method that when you reward obedience or proper behavior, and there's punishment or negative results to incorrect behavior. I don't know, this ought to be so obvious. Somehow that's slipped away a little bit from our understanding of faith, and I want to see if we can get that restored today. Now, for instance, in some of the Christian world, people speak of faith. Well, faith is based on grace. God loves us, we believe in him, we receive from him. That's fine, but that also has obedience. If we receive his grace, we have to obey him. Now, if you take that simple part of obedience out of faith, then I personally think you miss the point. I want you to notice, if there's any place that speaks of salvation by grace, it's the book of Romans. But notice in the first chapter of the book of Romans chapter 1, verse 5, and also in the last chapter of Romans chapter 16, verse 26, it says, I want to bring everyone in all the nations to the obedience of faith. Faith involves an obedience. Faith is the ability to obey God. And so faith in the Bible is not disconnected from an act of obedience. It demands obedience. If you disconnect it from that, then faith becomes something of philosophy, mental principles, theology, and that if it doesn't bring you to a place of obedience, frankly, you'd be better off not knowing it. But faith brings us into a place of obedience, and obedience comes with faith. It's not separate. You don't want to separate the idea of faith and grace from the idea of obedience. You remember as well, Yeshua told a parable in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. He says that, let's look at two people building a house. He said there's somebody that builds a house on a rock and those who build his house on the sand. And what was the point? He said, those who will do the word of God. If you'll do what God says, that's the rock. It's not just believing philosophically, even spiritually. Faith has to come to the point of obedience. If you do what he says, then you have a kind of faith that's built on the rock. And if you don't do it, then you have a kind of faith that's built on the sand, and it won't hold up. So I'm thinking about the thesis of the book of Romans, which we call salvation by grace and faith, but that faith is involved in obedience. And Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount, the type of faith that works is that you do what the Word of God says, and that is building the house on the rock. We said the center part of the book of Deuteronomy, in Ekev V'Re'eh, it's saying that God has put before us blessing and cursing, and with commandments, and if we obey Him, then we will come into the blessings. So I'm simply saying, folks, right actions, obedience, doing what God tells us to do will bring good results, and disobeying Him or not obeying Him are going to bring bad results. And that's what we have to look at in our own lives, spiritually, with our children, understanding the scriptures, that's all part of it. I know sometimes people, I taught about this once, that it's about spiritual life, and I said it's kind of like a triple jump. You have to, one, meditate on scriptures, you understand God's principles, and then you pray in the Spirit to understand what God's telling you to do, and then you have the whole rest of it is total, absolute obedience and sacrificial love and integrity and generosity. You have to get to that third point where there's obedience involved. And that's what kicks all of your faith into action and completes it. So we want to say that whether it's the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Romans, whether it's Yeshua's teaching, it all means that our faith comes to a point of doing the right thing, and faith leads to obedience. The obedience that is of faith is what brings you into salvation. Now, I'd have to say this about reward and punishment. We want to talk about children a little bit, but I try, knowing that that's the case, I try to help myself with my own personal discipline. If it's doing good things, if it's giving, if it's reading, if it's helping someone, if it's praying, that when I do something, if there's something else that would seem to me to be a reward, I want to put that off until I do a part of obedience that might seem difficult. In other words, don't reward yourself beforehand, reward yourself afterwards, so that you can use that as having some kind of reward, so to help you to be motivated, because that's what the idea of reward and punishment is for, is to motivate you to do the right thing. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That's the technique of God, is obedience, blessing, and cursing. I also want to say that as we look to children, a younger child, the time between reward and punishment to the activity has to be very short. If you have a dog, it has to be immediately. If the dog does something right, you have to immediately give him a biscuit. With a child, it can be a little longer. As the child gets a little older, the difference in time can be a little bit longer. As we become an adult, think of it, you have the same system, but the time between your action and your reward or punishment is a little longer. So for instance, you don't get your paycheck until the end of the month. So you work for a month doing the right thing, and then you get your reward, which is the paycheck. If you do that for a whole year, if you do it well, you might get a promotion or a lifting up of your salary. If you don't do it, you could get fired or you could get a demotion. And so you learn to make more time between the act and the reward or punishment. That demands more maturity. And we know that actually what God is saying, listen, it's not just waiting till the end of the month till you get your paycheck. We're talking about eternal rewards and punishments. What we do in this whole lifetime, we get to the end of this lifetime, and there is reward and punishment for what we did in this lifetime. That's part of the grace of God. The grace of God is that He forgives us if we ask Him to forgive us, and we have atonement in the blood of Yeshua for anything we've done wrong, but we have to repent and ask Him and change. And He gives us grace also by His Spirit to empower us with love and holiness and an ability to do what's right. But all that grace and all that faith is also connected with that something happens. So what you do in this lifetime through obedience and grace and faith in Yeshua gets you to the point that what you do in this lifetime then after that has eternal rewards. So you go from a very short span of the difference in time between the action and the reward and the punishment with a child to a moderate amount as you're growing up. It's a little more when you're a teenager and more when you're adult, but we are supposed to get the idea before we die so we understand that everything in this lifetime is headed toward eternal reward or punishment. Now, I think if you don't understand that in the day-to-day life, you're not really going to understand the fact that there is reward and punishment. A lot of people say that they believe in reward and punishment, but I'm not so sure that they do. So I want to make sure this happens. Now, another thing is that when we start out with reward and punishment, which is pretty simple things, we're talking about a character and a carrot and a stick. Really today it might be candy and Mr. Spoon, but that grows. That afterwards you don't want to need something physical that can turn into words, to principles. A righteous person, you just have to talk to them. That's enough punishment or reward. A word of encouragement can be enough of reward. A word of correction can be enough of a punishment. That's also a rod. Yeshua doesn't punish us all with a physical rod. He says the rod of His mouth. Just correct us. Look at the epistles in the book of Revelation. Yeshua said, look, I have this against you. You did this right, you did this wrong. And He talks to them. That's part of their reward and punishment. Not everything is physical. So we want to develop from the clearer aspects of physical reward and punishment to transfer that to word. Word is where we want to live. And we also want to transfer it from discipline that comes from somebody imposing on us from the outside to discipline that is self-imposed from the inside. I don't need somebody to spank me right now. I don't need somebody to give me a piece of candy. I understand the principle. I can discipline myself. You can discipline yourself. So we want to go from outward reward and punishment to dealing with words. We want to go from somebody else doing it to that being internalized in ourselves. And eventually it comes to the point that the outward mechanism of doing what's right or doing what's wrong, being rewarded or being punished, is inside of you, inside of your spirit, in your conscience. The Bible tells us in Romans 2 that the conscience tells us when we're doing something right and wrong. So all this is an outward mechanism that we want to internalize it into our character so that doing the right thing becomes not just a decision that's difficulty that you're obeying, not because you really want to, but you have to. It becomes part of your character and part of who you are to do what is right. But you have to go through a process of training to train yourself to do that's right. And when you see that you're not doing something so well, then give yourself some external parameters for yourself to get yourself going. Once the habit gets going, we say this, if you do something one time, it's a decision. If you do that same thing 30 days in a row, it becomes a habit. If you do it 1 year in a row, it becomes part of your character. So that's what we want to do. We want to go through the process from external rewards and punishments to internalizing it to develop a righteous kind of character. Well, that's an introduction to this. I also want to talk a little bit about education for children because the idea of educating children with a little bit of reward or punishment was pretty well accepted in all of human history, I think, up until fairly recently. It seems like recently there's been kind of an attitude, well, you never want to spank a child. You never want to give him that kind of punishment that might hurt his feelings. Well, no, we don't see it that way. And in fact, there is a place also for physical punishment, and I want to take a few minutes to describe this because I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying. We're talking about something that's very moderate. We're not talking about extreme violence, but we're also not talking about extreme, let the child do whatever he wants. There's a balanced, gentle, clear way of dealing with your child with reward and punishments. We want to look at it. Now, what we call Mr. Spoon or the rod, you'll find that 6 times mentioned in the book of Proverbs. Just to save time, I'll just give you the citations now. But in Proverbs 10:13 and Proverbs 13:24 and Proverbs 22:15 and Proverbs 23:13, 23:14, and 29:15, it encouraged parents is that you have to use the rod on your child to make sure that he's doing what's right. Now, if a child does something wrong, that's a simple punishment that can be used to help the child to know that. Now, in the Bible, they use the word gav for back, but in our day we kind of interpret that as your yashvan, your little rear end, which God has given a nice little padding there, even a little child that you can give a little smack on the tushy, as we say. Now, and I believe that it's very important to know how to do that. Now, let's go back to what we were saying about word. The external reward and punishment is there, hopefully, to get us as soon as possible so that the child responds to words alone. Words is what we want. But if the word response is collapsing, then we need to use external rewards or punishment. Remember that Yeshua said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Well, we don't want to, that's part of just business interactions in life, but it's also part of children's education. We want, when we tell our children, when we say something to them, it needs to be clear that they can trust what their parents are saying. We need to say to them clearly yes or no. And if we say not to do something and they do it, you can have a second warning, maybe a third warning. But you can't just go on talking because your word, there will be a deflation of the meaning of your words. You don't want your words to become deflated so that the child will think if my mommy or daddy says not to do something, he doesn't really mean it. He can say no, and I say I'm going to do it anyway, and it won't make any difference. That's not correct behavior. Formulating. We want to help our children with formulating correct behavior. And so we want to say, when we say yes, do this, we say no, don't do that. That word, we need to make sure they understand it. You might have to repeat it once, but the idea is don't just say it and then keep repeating it and let your words become deflated so that the child learns subconsciously when mommy or daddy says something, they don't really mean it, and I don't really have to obey that. Because that will reflect much later on in their conscience, saying, well, I don't really have to obey what God tells me to do either, because there won't be rewards and punishment. If we don't do simple rewards and punishment with our children, something will be ingrained in their consciousness that they don't think there is such a thing as reward or punishment. Now, how can your words of education, how can they become more and more deflated? Well, one is if you keep repeating it and don't do anything. Another way it gets deflated is if you start raising your voice. I'd have to say in Israel, in a lot of ways, this is the way of education, is that parents and teachers just start screaming at the kids. But why would you do that? If a child doesn't listen, then you just start yelling, then you're telling the child, when I say something, it doesn't mean anything. You have to wait till I yell, and then it means something. But then if you yell, maybe that doesn't mean anything either. In other words, you're causing your words to become meaningless. Shouting the same word that you just said doesn't make the word, it deflates the meaning of the word. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen sometimes, but basically the idea of inflating your words by shouting deflates the value of the word. So you don't want to do that. You want to talk clearly, and you don't have to shout. We want to train our children to obey when we speak clearly to them. Now, what can even be worse is if the child is misbehaving and they say, well, here, let me give you a piece of candy, let me reward you. You're going to reward them to get them to, if they're doing something wrong, as if that's going to get them to stop. What did you just do? You just rewarded improper behavior. What do we say? the basic rule of human behavioral science is whatever behavior you reward is going to be repeated. So if you give them a simple reward when they're doing something wrong, that's only going to encourage them to do it wrong again. That's not what we want to do. We want to have this simple instructions, clear on a level that the age of the child can understand it. Of course, there's a difference between a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old. It has to be according to the right level and according to the right time and the explanation, and do something moderate. But I'm saying don't make your means of enforcement to be shouting or rewarding the wrong thing. What we want to simply do is explain clearly what is expected. Expect the child to do that. Stand with it in loving authority. And if it happens, then you find a proper moderate reward. If it doesn't happen, then you find a proper and moderate punishment to go with that. Now, one of the things is, of course, you can use words as a punishment, as we said. If you tell a child, that was wrong what you did right now, that might be enough for the child to understand that he can feel punished by the wrong words. I wouldn't suggest ever shouting, because that's not, you want him to be sensitive to the content of what you're saying. But that might be enough, but sometimes it isn't. Now, when, and of course today, wouldn't it be great if our children would think that getting a carrot was a reward? They don't think that today. You have to do something else. But unfortunately today it's a lot of sometimes giving them a little film on the social media to look at or whatever it is. But of course you have to watch out for the content on that. But you don't want, that's another thing. Today, if a child just wants to see a little film or a cartoon, you just don't want to do that all the time. You want to say, use that as the you do a proper behavior, and then you can be rewarded with this, with a moderate amount. Set the behavior that is expected, set the reward that's going to come after that. And if it doesn't, then there can be a punishment. Now, the punishment can be taking away things, but one of the aspects of punishment that's been used by parents throughout all generations is simple, the use of a little rod on the rear end. And I would say, as far as I can tell in the Bible, that is scriptural. For those of us who do that with our children, that we usually find the rear end is the proper place. God put some padding in there so it doesn't really hurt. You don't really do any damage there. Let me say that we're talking about something moderate. The force that's got to be used is just hard enough so that it will cause a little bit of pain. With a little child, you barely have to touch him, and it'll be enough. For a little older child, it may have to be a little stronger, but we're obviously not even getting close to anything that would be representative of violence or causing any kind of physical damage. We're not talking about that. We're talking about moderate, loving use of some kind of physical punishment to get the point across. Now, the child has to know, when do you use physical punishment? When the child knows that he has disobeyed. He understood and he decided to disobey. If there's a question whether the child really understood or not, then you have to go back to an explanation. I don't mean that he needs to understand everything that was behind the reasoning, but he has to be clearly told that I told you not to do this and you did that and you know it. And then it can have a simple punishment with it. It's very important today that at any time that is sandwiched with loving affirmation both before and after, saying we love you. This is not, but you did something wrong. We're going to punish you. You do the punishment, and then you come back to reward, back to loving affirmation. Now, and that is healthy for the child, because the child is not going to go around thinking that you're mad at him all day. When you do a few seconds and the punishment is clear, and then you go back to loving one another instead of ruining the atmosphere between parent and child, that you're frustrated, you're angry, you're shouting, the child isn't doing, the child is disobeying. That's a thing that could go on for hours, and you don't want that. So you find a proper reward and a proper punishment, and if it can be a simpler punishment or just saying no to the child again or tell them they did wrong, that's fine. But if it needs a physical punishment, we suggest a little wooden spoon on the rear end has been effective for generations. I also want to say that should never be done in anger. If you are in anger, then stop. You are sinning. Stop and get control of yourself. How can you tell the difference? If you couldn't stop in a moment, if you couldn't stop right there, then you're in anger. It's just, you're not angry. You're disciplining your child lovingly, patiently, under control. It's not violent. It's not extreme. It's not in anger. It's not anything. Now, in the past, we could even say that husbands and wives could confer upon that together. That's good. Report to one another. It's always good to have your spouse involved so that you're in cooperation. Today, I would say it might even be good if someone else is there with you in the room. But now, when you use reward and punishment, if it is using some kind of physical punishment, then as the child grows, then of course you have to do a little more than a little tiny tap on the rear as you would with little baby. But you also get to the point as the child gets older, particularly when he turns 11, 12, or 13, God has given him the ability to ask questions. At that point, you can't say to the child, just do it because I said that. When the child is younger, he has to learn just to respond, I told you not to do that, now you're being punished. When a child becomes older, a teen, he begins to have rational thinking. He's analyzing. God's giving that. You don't want to just respond to that and say, that's because I told you to do so. No, you need to take the time there and explain the reasons to the adolescent. That's the process of him grasping the rationale so that he can internalize it and do it to himself. So we do simple acts of reward and punishment to a younger child, then moving into with explanation and discipline, looking to internalize it as a child gets older. And then as an adult is someone who can internalize it and make that all self-disciplined, conscience, right decisions as he grows through adult life and takes responsibility. And that leads you to the spiritual principles that what we do in this life, our actions will be eternally rewarded or punished. And we build this into our character, the warnings of God and the promises of God will be obvious. If we don't, we've built into our educational system and our own activity and our own behavior a way that is contrary to that. Well, let me pray for you. Father, I pray in the name of Yeshua for our own personal discipline. We thank you for the right way to educate our children through word and through instructions, through the Bible, through prayer, through love, but also when it's needed to know how to use moderate, equivalent reward and punishment that the child can grow and then understand. We thank you for ourselves, Lord, that we can understand these principles of reward and punishment, that we do what is right, as Yeshua said, that we can build our house on the rock and be ready as we go through this whole lifetime to face you and to be ready for eternal reward and eternal punishment, and that we, thank God, by grace and faith and obedience to Yeshua, we will be on the reward and blessing side. Amen. God bless you.